I'm Carrie Cordero. Hopefully you can hear me okay. If I'm too loud, or if you're in the back of the room and you can't hear one of us, just wave and we'll adjust our volume. Welcome to CNAS's annual conference and luncheon. We're here today to talk about journalism and leaks, and I've got a really terrific panel of discussants to join me for the conversation. So enjoy your lunch. If those of you who downloaded the conference app want to participate throughout the discussion here, we do have a few polling questions that we'll do. We've got 3 questions. So throughout the conversation, based on where we are in the conversation, I've got a couple questions I'll pose, and then we'll put the responses up on the screen. We're going to keep this a sort of ongoing conversation. At the end, we are looking forward to taking a few of your questions. So enjoy your lunch, and then I hope as we get towards the end of the conversation, you'll have a few questions and be willing to engage with this really terrific panel. So I want to spend a couple minutes introducing them to you if you're not familiar with them already. Shane Harris, sitting right next to me, is the staff writer with the Washington Post. Shane is a longtime intelligence and national security reporter. If you're interested in intelligence and national security and you're not reading Shane at the Washington Post, you need to start right away, because he is a must-read and is such an expert in this area. He previously was writing for the Wall Street Journal, the Daily Beast, and the National Journal, and he has 2 books out. One is The Watchers, The Rise of America's Surveillance State, and another one is At War, The Rise of the Military Internet Complex. And so I'm really excited that Shane is here. He's actively reporting on many of the cases that we'll be able to touch on today. Kate Brannon, I'm thrilled to welcome. She is the editorial director of Just Security, which is a national security and legal website, and is a terrific forum for the legal and national security community. She's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Scowcroft Center for International Security at the Atlantic Council. She's written in a variety of publications, including having previously been a senior reporter covering the Pentagon for foreign policy. And before that, she was a defense reporter at Politico. She is frequently cited throughout the media, on radio, on TV, and we're thrilled that Kate is able to join us today with her national security and editorial experience. Bruce Brown, I'm happy to welcome, is a former journalist and partner at a Washington law firm, and is currently the executive director of the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. He's a lecturer at the University of Virginia, where he co-directs the First Amendment Clinic, and has been published widely, and is really knowledgeable about current efforts focusing on freedom of the press issues. So Bruce, thanks so much for joining us today. And Alex Abdo, I'm also thrilled to welcome. Alex is currently a senior staff attorney at the Knight First Amendment Institute, which, if you're not familiar with it, is a relatively new institute housed at Columbia University, focusing exclusively on First Amendment issues. The Knight Institute was involved, I think, spearheaded the recent litigation regarding the president's use of Twitter as a public forum. So that was a big case that they recently handled. Alex previously was a senior staff attorney at the ACLU and has been heavily involved over the years on national security litigation matters. So this is really a terrific group to have kick off this conversation. Just to kind of start and frame our discussion a little bit, leaks of national security information are not new. There have, over the years and the decades, always been cases that involve prosecutions and government investigations involving leaks of classified information. But there is a sense in the national security policy press community that something a little bit different is going on in recent years. And what I hope to explore is whether that has to do with the fact that there is actually more leaking going on. We hear a lot of allegations about so many leaks taking place. So I'd like us to drill down a little bit on, is there really more leaking going on? And secondly, is the way that the government is investigating, pursuing, and prosecuting these leaks, has something changed? Because again, that's another area where we hear allegations of new efforts and new enforcement, but this is really a great group to drill down on that a little bit. So Shane, I'm going to start with you and ask you if you can just sort of give me your initial impression as to whether or not we really are in a new age of leaks. Are there more leaks? Is there more law enforcement? You're out there every day reporting on these issues. What do you think?
I think my short answer to that is yes and yes. More leaks and more investigation, and I'll kind of maybe try to frame it a little bit to give some perspective on that and why this seems unusual, this moment that we're in. When we talk about press leaks, and I should say more, maybe to put a finer point on it, when the president talks about press leaks, you really have to think about these things in two categories of national security leaks, we might call them, which is what we're talking about right now. So classified information, things that are law enforcement sensitive or sensitive to the Defense Department or the intelligence agencies that they don't want to see published, versus non-classified leaks, which right now the bulk of them are, I would say, probably people in the administration in the White House talking about their day-to-day observations of working in this rather unconventional administration. I think a lot of what the president fulminates about and gets annoyed about falls into that second category. And those are not illegal. I mean, people, it might get you fired from your job at the White House, but it's not illegal to talk about what's happening at the office with a reporter. And I think the bulk of what you've seen in terms of the reporting coming out of the White House press corps and what's going on behind closed doors, that is informed by a lot of those kinds of sourcing. But to the first part of what we're really talking about here, I do think that there's more leaking of a sensitive variety than I've seen in my career of about 20 years on the beat. More people who are willing to talk about sensitive matters, people who I'm not used to talking to, who are kind of coming forward, the question, I guess, becomes, why and what are they talking about? And I think, others will have views on this too, but there's a sense of everything that's happening right now is so extraordinary and unusual, and I think a lot of people want to come talk about that and seek out reporters to discuss it. What I haven't seen is a lot of operational leaking, right? So you haven't seen like the big stories about like in 2005 when the New York Times broke the story of warrantless wiretapping. You haven't seen stories of necessarily of the kind like when the Washington Post exposed the network of so-called black sites that the CIA was running. These things have tended to be focused more on what's happening behind the scenes in policymaking in the administration. Now, as far as the number of investigations, I take Attorney General Sessions at his word when he said last summer that there were 3 times as many leak investigations open as there were at the end of the Obama administration. And I think for reporters covering the beat, we had long been expecting that we were going to start seeing evidence of that coming out into the public in the form of indictments of individuals who were alleged to have disclosed information to reporters. A couple of weeks ago, we did see a senior Senate staffer indicted for lying to the FBI in the course of a leak investigation. So I think a lot of us feel like Sessions might not have been exaggerating when he said that the heat was being turned up. And we see that reflected, I think, in other ways in talking to sources too. So yes, a lot more people talking, a lot more reporters, and I think we're now seeing, some indications that the government is investigating that a lot harder and more thoroughly than they may have in the past.
So this distinction that you draw between leaks of classified information, which then is a potential violation of law, versus just sort of regular, what I call Washington leaks, the inside baseball of how government works, really is a huge difference. It's a legal difference in terms of the consequences. It's different so we're gonna. I want to make sure when I talk to Kate, I have a question for you. Speaking just about the leaks of national security information. So because that's really where there's potential prosecutive issues, setting aside the inside baseball, type leaks. As a former reporter, how does this new environment then, if we take Shane's point of view that there really are more leaks and there's more investigation according to Attorney General Sessions, how do reporters then need to digest that information if the reporter's job is to get information to be able to report to the public? How is this changing the way that reporters are thinking about working with their sources of information?
Well, I think not too much has changed for reporters from the Obama administration to the Trump administration. If anything, it's just hammered home the need to protect your technology. Things that you kind of should have done under Obama now is standard operating procedure. Everyone has switched to Signal as like a default. That goes for reporters, but it also goes for sources. Like it would have been unusual 2 years ago to find everyone you need to talk to on Signal, but now they're all there. But I also think, the same way everyone's more vulnerable to cyber intrusion and hacking, and for reporters, government seizure of your communications, you just have to take what should be the right precautions for everything, when it comes to your technology, whether that's two-factor authentication, with Signal, set it to disappearing texts, things like that. That I think for the general population, we haven't caught up to that yet either. It kind of takes a scary thing to happen to you to go, oh no. But I think eventually that will happen to everybody, and we'll all sort of start protecting our communications better. What I've really seen change.
Just to follow up on that, so when you're talking about protecting your communications, you're really talking about using apps or other methods of communication that are encrypted so that the government has a harder time being able to get access to it?
Yes, definitely. And for myself, I should have been doing that earlier. I wasn't sort of on day one of, I can't remember when, but early on in the Trump, either pre-inauguration or after, I can't remember, completely switched over to that. And now I have a feeling that's still probably not enough, but it's sort of the new sort of bar, lowest bar for what you should be doing. Where I have seen the most change, I think, is for sources. I think the landscape has totally changed, and like Shane was saying, people are talking to him that maybe wouldn't have talked to journalists before. My sense from talking to my own sources is there's this sort of vast playing field of wrongdoing that they're witnessing, and far more than ever they're having to grapple with, does this rise to the level of leaking to the media? Should I blow the whistle or not? And I think people are being confronted with that decision far more than they ever were in past administrations, which is leading to more leaks. I also think there's a lot of mistrust within agencies, if I wanted to keep this inside my agency and report through the channels, who do I trust? I think that has changed quite a bit. I think there's a presumption of bad motivation, which can lead people to talk to the media when maybe, because there is so much unusual stuff going on. I was thinking particularly about the story with Michael Cohen's suspicious activity reports at Treasury. Mm-hmm. Ronan Farrow for The New Yorker reported this piece that one of 3 of these SARs had disappeared, and the investigator, I think it was an investigator at Treasury, decided to leak this to the press, or leak the other 2 to the press, because they thought that maybe they would also be disappeared. And the source assumed that it had been disappeared sort of for the wrong purposes by somebody who was trying to quash, whether it's the Mueller investigation or the Cohen investigation. And it turns out that might not be the case. It's just that this is such a high stakes investigation that perhaps somebody at Treasury took the precaution to I'm going to protect this specific SAR. So I think that's an example of, people trying to do the right thing, but kind of not knowing what to make of what they're seeing happening around them. And then the other thing I think that I've experienced with my own sources is there's an awful lot of public harassment these days of government, civil servants and government officials, whether it's on Twitter. The Obama holdover label that then gets out into the media. So it's just a much more vicious kind of political environment. And then there were the insider threat investigations done in the White House. So I think it's just a really dicey time for civil servants and government officials to kind of figure out, how am I going to navigate the Trump administration? And when does something rise to the level that I feel like I'm going to take this incredibly unusual step and seek out a reporter and talk to them? And I think they usually know the risks involved, and they weigh those and decide whether or not it's worth it to them.
So, again, we sort of find ourselves back in this space between the difference between individuals who are working perhaps in the intelligence community, who have access to sensitive national security information and perhaps think that there's something that is going on that's wrong, that needs to get out into the public space. Or you mentioned sort of the White House insider looks, where that was more the White House trying to tamp down individuals in the White House from talking to the press about what was going on in the White House, but very different than exposing a national security program. It's the exposure of the national security program, again, that would then implicate the Justice Department conducting an investigation and potential prosecution. So, Bruce, I want to ask you about, under the prior administration, what were the rules? So there was a memo issued by former Attorney General Holder that I think is still in place, actually, that governs when the Justice Department can seek the records of a journalist in the course of conducting a leak investigation. So on one hand, we have the Attorney General saying we're being more aggressive. On the other hand, I'm not so sure that the policy has actually changed. So can you talk a little bit about what the current state of play is?
Sure, thank you. And just to pick up on some of the comments from Shane and Kate, in referring to the interesting national moment we're in, I would just say, particularly to this group by way of being welcomed here today, that I was not long at a investigative journalism conference in Berkeley. And you can imagine the scene. It's Berkeley, California. It's a room full of investigative journalists. And former Director Brennan is Skyped in for an interview. And he is greeted with a hero's welcome. And then you think, wait, this is Berkeley, and this is a former CIA director, and this is a group of investigative reporters, and he practically gets a standing, rousing ovation. So we're in a very unusual time. There's no doubt about that. And Carrie, to pick up on your question, there was a comprehensive review during the Obama administration of what are now nearly 50-year-old internal guidelines that govern Justice Department conduct in investigations that lead to legal demands for the records of journalists. And those guidelines were put in place by John Mitchell, which again tells you something about where the country's moved in 50 years. And they were largely unchanged until 2014 and 2015. After the disclosures about the toll record subpoena for AP phone records, followed very shortly thereafter by another disclosure that kind of shocked newsrooms around the country, that a warrant had been issued for Gmails of a Fox News reporter, and that the government had been able to obtain those materials because it identified the reporter as an unindicted co-conspirator in an affidavit. The Justice Department under AG Holder convened a series of meetings with news organizations and media lawyers and other people in the civil liberties community to talk about ways to revise the guidelines. They had not been touched since 1980, when toll record subpoenas were made a part of them, and to figure out if the rules could be restructured in a way that would obviate the concerns of journalists, particularly about the AP toll records subpoena and the Fox search warrant, the AP issue being in part that the news organization was not notified ahead of time that its phone records were the subject of this subpoena. Had it been notified, the AP lawyers would have gone to the Justice Department and tried to negotiate, certainly at the very least, a narrowing of the subpoena. It's possible that there may have been legal practice, motions practice over the subpoena in an effort to quash it. And those meetings with the Justice Department starting in the summer of 2013 have led to a dialogue that is still going on today that the Reporters Committee has helped to convene between DOJ and newsroom leaders. And there were a number of very important changes that were made in 2014 and 2015. Among them, the presumption of notice to an affected journalist or a news organization when a legal demand seeks their materials has been flipped. The old policy was we're only going to notify you if we have found that our investigation will not be compromised. The flipping of the presumption means we will notify you, and only if we find otherwise about the compromising of our investigation will we withhold notice. And so with the presumption of notice now written into the rules, that gives news organizations some assurance that if their communications records are the subject of an investigation, they will have the chance to negotiate and possibly move to quash. In the Watkins subpoena, or the number of different instruments, the subpoena and also 2703D order there, she was not notified. That is because the presumption, even though flipped in the new policy, can still be overcome if the department finds that notice would imperil the investigation. Here, the department felt that notice would, for various reasons, I think their position is that the investigation potentially faced some threat if they had given her advance notice. Other policy changes in 2014 and 2015 involved bringing search warrants into the policy for the first time, various kinds of new tools the government has to get information from internet service providers, for example. I mentioned these 2703D orders are now part of the policy. And then the government also made efforts to meet the concerns of news organizations that what happened in the James Rosen case, the Fox News reporter, would not happen again. That is, the government would not label a journalist a co-conspirator in an Espionage Act investigation in order to get around the protections of something called the Privacy Protection Act, which protects journalistic work product from subpoenas. There is an exception if you are a suspect. That's what the government used in 2013. That concern has also been addressed in the 2014 and 2015 changes.
So, Bruce, these new policies that are put in place during the Obama administration, those were the result of, there was basically a media committee, right? That interacted with the Justice Department. I don't know, was it with like the Deputy Attorney General's office or the Attorney General's office?
It was,
there was sort of a task force.
We met with both AGs, Holder and Lynch, and they had teams that were working on these issues with them. And under the current administration, the group has met twice with Dag Rosenstein.
Okay, so it does still, so I think that's important for people to know, right? That this committee of media organizations, that representatives and the Deputy Attorney General's office, that is still considered a live body. Is there a perspective on the media side of it that people feel like they're getting less attention now, or they still feel do they still feel
less
confident?
Attention is the best kind of attention.
But I mean, in terms of the activity of the committee, in the media community, do people still feel like that's a functioning?
Very much so. I mean, the group has met twice every 6 months, and that's pretty much what we were doing under the prior administration. And these rules are still intact, and the government was looking at these procedures and following them in recent cases. They are, I should say, they're internal guidelines. They do not have the force of law, but they have become through the years, even long before they were revised in 2014 and 2015, they form a really fundamental bedrock of the relationship between news organizations and the Justice Department. I think it was Matt Cooper, after the Valerie Plame Scooter Libby case, made the comment that for this process really to work, journalists and prosecutors need to understand each other's perspectives and to be meeting with each other and to have a dialogue with each other. And I think one of the main benefits of these meetings is to give the journalists in the room the chance to explain their tradecraft to the government, to let the government explain to the reporters in the room what their investigative needs are. The guidelines have always been about balancing the two different set of interests. And the fact that we are still having those conversations today, I think, is very important for the direction of the relationship between the newsrooms and the Justice Department.
So let me turn to Alex, picking up on that point. So a lot of time when there is a case that comes out, and in a few minutes we'll drill down a little bit more on the recent case out of the Senate Intelligence Committee, but every time there is a new significant case, there does seem to be sort of an uproar from the media side. Oh my God, a reporter's records were accessed by the government in some way, and it's important to note that the government we don't have a government representative here on the panel, so I'm going to channel a little bit the government side of things, just to add that perspective. The government would say that they are accessing these records using legal process. So Bruce mentioned a couple of the statutes that are involved. It could be a subpoena, it could be under 2703, which is the provision of the criminal code that enables the government to get records from a communications company. Alex, so how should we think sort of at the bigger picture then about the government's need to get this information? I mean, the government has an obligation under the law to investigate the unauthorized disclosure of classified information. How should we think about that while at the same time being concerned about the infringement on First Amendment activity, if that's the argument from the media perspective?
Yeah, let me try to answer that, but at the same time also pick up on where Bruce left off. It's interesting to note that the guidelines are guidelines. And the reason that the guidelines are guidelines is that there is not a body of constitutional doctrine that demarcates the line between a kind of legitimate government investigation that involves media sources and media reporters and an overreaching one. Largely, it's the case that if the Fourth Amendment allows a search to take place, it allows the government to engage in a particular kind of investigative activity, the First Amendment is silent. That's the, more or less, that's a kind of oversimplified but a rough summary of the current state of doctrine. And so the result is that the protections that are in place for journalists who are doing this sort of work are largely cultural ones. They're largely ones that have to do with the norms that have built up around the interaction between reporters doing their work and prosecutors doing theirs. And that's why it's heartening to see that the conversations are still taking place. That's an important part of the culture staying in place and being developed. And it's also why you see rushes to the defense after every leak investigation is announced by fellow journalists, and why you see rushes on the other side to defend the investigative activity that took place, because the line is defined through that interaction. It's not defined by law. I also want to note that another important kind of point about the guidelines. There's a lot of discretion in the guidelines that I think shapes their use. One important omission from the guidelines is that they don't apply to national security letters, for example. And they are understood not to apply generally to national security investigative authorities. They apply, to more law enforcement authorities. And so if the Department of Justice wants to issue an NSL to a communications service provider in an authorized national security investigation.
An NSL, a national security letter being the national security
Subpoena power.
Subpoena power. So
Yeah.
it's not a grand jury subpoena in the criminal side. It's
Right.
a request by the government, a letter that gets sent to
Yeah.
request documents that that on the criminal investigation would be obtained through a subpoena.
That's right, and it's a request with legal bite. You're not at liberty to ignore the request. You have to respond to the request, and they're issued by FBI agents of a sufficient seniority. And those requests, even if they involve the records of journalists, are not subject to the media guidelines. The Department of Justice may be applying some version of the media guidelines to those requests, and they're thinking about when to issue them. But that would be a matter of kind of purely internal office culture and policy, not one that's set out in regulation or elsewhere in law. That's one kind of example of a play in the joints of the media guidelines. Another example is that I think Bruce was mentioning that if you are many of the protections that the guidelines provide you don't apply if you're a journalist. Don't apply if you are the subject or the target of the investigation. And there's a sense in which that may make sense, but it's also important to understand that the government's interpretation of the Espionage Act, which is what criminalizes the disclosure of classified information or national defense information, is likely broad enough to encompass much of what national security reporters do every single day, which is report on classified information. And if that's so, and if a Justice Department wanted to get aggressive in its interpretation or application of the media guidelines, it could internally label a reporter the subject of an Espionage Act investigation and avoid, many of the protections that the media guidelines provide. So there's a lot of play in the joints, which is just to make the point that even though the rules have stayed the same, largely the same over the last few years and over the last few decades, how they're implemented really matters. And the culture that any particular Department of Justice brings to those guidelines really matters to journalists. So to answer your question more directly, Carrie, I think in an ideal world, in an ideal democracy, we wouldn't need leaks. And we wouldn't need the sort of press that we have today. In an ideal democracy, government would disclose the information that's essential for people to self-govern. Self-government would be a natural, it would flow naturally from the information that the government discloses. But we don't live in an ideal world, and it's naive to think we'll ever accomplish that because we're humans. And if there's any conclusion you can draw from the last few millennia of human experience is that we are flawed. And the result is that we rely on checks and balances to constrain government authority and to give people the information they need to self-govern. That's reflected in our system of government. It's reflected in the fact that we all think of the media as fulfilling this kind of fourth estate role of being an effective check on government. The media is not, there's no Article 4 is not dedicated to the media, even though 1, 2, and 3 are dedicated to Congress, the executive, and the judiciary. But they have this kind of pseudo-constitutional status because without the media, we wouldn't be able to fairly call ourselves a democracy. Because we are flawed and because our systems are flawed, you have to ask the question, are there instances in which reporters and the public interest in having sufficient information about government to self-govern should rely on leaks? And I think the answer, unfortunately, is yes. I think leaks are a necessary part of our culture. Much of the reporting that you read every day about government and about the national security policy in particular relies on maybe what I'll call run-of-the-mill leaks. I imagine that Shane has a lot of sources that he talks to every day who inform his stories in a way that doesn't rise to the level of a James Wolfe-style disclosure of information about classified information, even though some of the information may very well be classified because we have a massive overclassification problem in this country. So I think it's essential. The hard question for me is, even if you're in this first category of classified disclosures, what's the limiting principle? How do you think about the ethics of disclosing information? If you agree with me that it's a necessary feature of our democracy, what are the limits on it? What are the ethics of it? And here's where I'll get disappointingly cagey. I think it's hard to come up with a list of kind of coherent principles for how people should think about leaks. I think, but I would suggest that there are two kind of important institutional constraints on leaking. One is that there's a real cost to being a leaker in government. many leakers sacrifice, some leakers are subject to criminal prosecution, but even short of criminal prosecution, if you leak information that the government really, really cares about you leaking, you may very well have sacrificed your livelihood. If your job relied on the clearance, you're going to lose your clearance, you'll lose your job, you'll lose your ability to go back into a job that requires clearance, you'll lose your ability to go work for contractors that require you to have clearance to have those jobs. There's a real consequence. And so I don't think that most leakers take lightly the act of leaking sensitive information. Now that's cold comfort to a government agent who sees the information leaked nonetheless, and they would have drawn the line differently than this leaker drew. But it's just to suggest that, these aren't callous acts or thoughtless acts. The second kind of institutional constraint is that I think people get the urge to leak when they see an imbalance between what the government knows and what the public knows. And the greater that imbalance, the greater the pressure that builds up internally for information to get out. And leaking is kind of a safety valve. It releases that pressure. But the government has a kind of direct control of that pressure. Government can influence the gap between what the government knows and what the public knows. And it can disclose information in a responsible way that narrows that gap, that makes it less likely that people will disclose information. I think you see the most dramatic leaks when there is the most dramatic imbalance. So I'll stop there.
Okay, so I'm going to pause you there, and we've talked a little bit, we've alluded to this new case regarding the Senate Intelligence Committee, James Wolfe, who was recently indicted. So we're going to pick up on that, and before we get into that case in a little bit more detail, I want to put up the first question. So if you have your conference app, our first polling question then is, does it get put up here? There we go. Is it ever appropriate to subpoena or search a reporter's communications during a leak investigation? So go ahead, if you're using the app, go ahead and answer that question, and we'll look at the answer in a second. In the meantime, Shane, I'm going to ask you to kind of get us a little bit more up to speed on the Wolfe case. So James Wolfe was the longtime, over 30 years, I think, security officer at the Senate Intelligence Committee. I, along with everybody else who used to work with that committee, knew him and interacted with him. He was recently charged. So you want to give us, you've been reporting on this a lot, what's sort of the nutshell of what this case is about, and then I'd like the panelists to weigh in on the issues that it raises.
Yeah, so Wolfe was in this position as the security director for the committee of having access to all kinds of classified information that comes before the committee, knowing who was testifying before the committee, including in closed session. There's a hallway outside the hearing room. Reporters like to hang out to try and find out what the scuttlebutt is. And Wolfe is sort of, a coordinator of a lot of the activity.
Just always around, right?
Yeah, kind of always around. Somebody described him as like Mr. Carson to the committee. He's like the butler who makes everything run and also knows all the secrets of the committee. And I mean that kind of in a literal and figurative sense. But so the indictment against Wolfe charges 3 separate counts of lying to FBI investigators who were investigating the leak of classified information. And it alleges that he had contact with multiple reporters. Now, he is not charged with leaking, but the allegations of leaking are very clearly laid out in the indictment.
And just, if I can just make a process point. So there's no law that says you can't leak. The crime is unauthorized disclosure of classified information, and he is not charged with that.
He is not charged with that, although I think it's fairly clear from the indictment that investigators believe he did exactly that to a number of reporters, including a woman named Allie Watkins at the New York Times now, who was previously at BuzzFeed and Politico, who is again not named in the indictment, but we understand from her own disclosures that she was also in a 3-year romantic relationship with Mr. Wolfe. Including during a period of time covered by the scope of this investigation. So in the course of investigating, investigators got a hold of a subpoena and got a subpoena for Allie Watkins, some of her phone and email records.
And how do we know that?
We know that because she disclosed that fact publicly. The government has not disclosed that. She made that known to her bosses at the New York Times. On the day that they were preparing to publish a story, as well as other newsrooms were on to the story that there was about to be this indictment of this senior Senate staffer. So our understanding of the timeline from the Times' account of it, and we've corroborated this as well, is that she discloses that to that fact to her bosses. Now, she was made aware that her communications had been obtained because she was sent a letter, or her attorney and she were sent a letter from the Justice Department notifying her of this after the fact. So we talked about these media guidelines that say when the government wants to get a hold of a reporter's records, they have to, the guidelines anyway, suggest that they tell the reporter, hey, we want to subpoena your phone records or your email in this investigation. We think that it could be potentially useful. I think there's like an internally like some kind of standard it has to rise to, which is why we think it's really important that we take this extraordinary step of getting hold of your records. Now, they didn't do that, we've reported at the Post in this case. They didn't notify her, that is, she found out after the fact, because they determined that the nature of her relationship with Jim Wolf was such that they felt that she could disrupt the investigation. Translation means, we're afraid she's going to tell him that we are investigating this matter. And they are within their rights, as I understand it, under the guidelines, to then decide not to notify Allie Watkins about this. Now, this leaves unanswered the questions of why they thought it was necessary to get her records in the first place. We've cited one official familiar with the events in the Post who said they felt that based on everything that they understood that Jim Wolf had to turn over or that the government obtained about him, they don't understand why the government also needed Allie Watkins' records. We also understand that the other 3 reporters anonymously identified in the indictment, their records were not obtained. So there's still some things that we don't understand. It may go to the nature of the relationship that she had with Jim Wolf. But it does raise, I mean, for those of us who are routinely covering these issues, the questions of, well, hold on a second. What was the internal process that you followed here? Why her records, but not the other 3 reporters that you're naming in the indictment? What exactly happened? And we still don't know a lot of answers to those questions. But this case becomes important because it's the first instance that we now know of in the Trump administration of prosecutors both bringing charges against someone they suspect of leaking, even though, again, they didn't charge him with that, and also going after a reporter's records.
Okay, so our results are in from our first question. Oh, I guess they're still changing a little bit. So of those are participating, 72% of those participating think that, yes, there are times when it's appropriate to obtain a reporter's questions. 28% think it's no. That's actually a decent amount think that no, it's never appropriate. So Kate, let me ask you to react, and panelists, feel free to weigh in. How do you react? How do you interpret this particular case, the Wolf case and the Watkins case, as an example of, is this government overreach, or was this an appropriate case? The government was trying to investigate, a guy who knew a lot of secrets, and I think it wasn't they started investigating him, right? It's that they knew that information was being disclosed to the public, and then that was where they honed in on. Where does this fall on the spectrum of, in your reaction?
It's just such a mess of a case. As you were saying before the panel got started, Allie Watkins does not make a great poster child because of this relationship. As Shane was saying, we don't know enough. Was it because she was his girlfriend that she was treated this way, or was it because she was a reporter, and where does the line get drawn, and where did it get drawn internally? There are all sorts of questions about sort of how her reporting was managed at each media outlet. Who knew what when? Was it okay? Because there are lots of sort of journalistic ethical questions that arise from it as well. Mm-hmm. And then specifically about the news that she was reporting, a lot of it involved, I think one of her first stories at BuzzFeed was revealed the identity of Carter Page in a previous federal investigation into Russian spies in New York. And just sort of given the circumstances of the Mueller investigation and of sort of the high stakes and the politicization of that, Carter Page had every right to have his identity protected in this case, and of all people to have another reason to complain that he was treated unfairly at Carter Page. I mean, it's a mess. So,
do we know yet in this case what the information was that they were looking at that was being investigated as having been exposed? So the Carter Page is one example.
I think it's also that he came to testify, right?
I think it's that he came to testify, and I think there's a presumption, and I hesitate to go much further than that there may be also an investigation into who disclosed the fact that there was a FISA warrant on Carter
Right.
Page.
So that's an open investigation.
I would
We
assume
would
so.
presume.
Yeah, you
Yeah.
can kind of read between the lines of the indictment and sort of see what you think that they're getting at. But, I think that there's some inference in that. And just to Kate's point, too, I mean, one of the reasons that this is a mess and not sort of a slam dunk for, First Amendment and reporter's privilege is there's a romantic relationship between a journalist and a source, which is not acceptable practice. I want to emphasize that. We don't know all of the parameters of this case, and it's very important to emphasize that everything we understand that Ali Watkins has told people is that he was not a source. There's now also an internal investigation at the New York Times into the matter, which I think we can all assume is trying to ascertain whether that is a true statement. But so there's a lot of complicating factors in this that make it difficult to sort of peel away all the layers. But there is still this core issue of the government decided in this case that it was necessary in the investigation to obtain years worth of a reporter's email addresses, including from her personal addresses and from an address she used in college. Why? I mean, we don't know the answer as to why.
Shane, do we know for sure that they didn't issue subpoenas for the records of the other 3
Yeah.
reporters? We know for sure they didn't?
That's
we've
the
reported
Justice
that.
Yeah,
Department
okay.
has that.
Yes.
You guys have it on the record.
Yeah.
And I guess from my perspective, looking at the nuts and bolts of the guidelines, there is a question about another prong the government's supposed to meet is the essentiality of the information. It's a 3-count indictment. If Ali Watkins is the only reporter whose records were seized, they had 2 counts that were clean without her, and they could have brought this case without her and without her records. And so I think there's some questions about why did you find her essential if you had a case that already was built and ready to go with 2 counts without her. I think pulling back from it, and I'm sure others will want to chime in on this too, there's the obvious point, we don't have an Official Secrets Act in this country. We have not deemed it criminal behavior for journalists and people who work in government, to have routine conversations. As Alex said, this is the bread and butter of a lot of American journalism is the kind of daily stories that come out about what's happening in the government. If Section 1001 is used with increasing frequency to catch, government officials in a trap, right, in a lie that you do have.
1001 being the making false statements.
For the false statements statute, this case, as others have pointed out, it's not an indictment related to the disclosure of classified information. It's a case about a false statement. And so there is a concern, of course, that if that statute is used routinely as a kind of trap for government officials who talk to reporters, that would be a really dangerous move for the country and would take us in the direction of other regimes like the Official Secrets Act in the UK, where there are extremely strict prohibitions against what we think of as routine relationship building.
Okay, I'd like to put up our second question, and that is going to take us into a discussion of what might be, I think I'm comfortable characterizing it as this, what might be one of the worst leaks of classified information that I think we've seen in recent years, which was the leak of the content of intercepts that Michael Flynn, the former national security advisor, had participated in. So conversations, the actual content of his conversations that had been intercepted were leaked. So the question is, in early 2017, newspapers reported that classified intelligence intercepts had captured incoming National Security Advisor Michael Flynn discussing sanctions with the Russian ambassador. This is what set in motion Flynn's eventual dismissal. And so the question to you on your app is, was this leak either justified in the view of the extraordinary circumstances, or was this leak a major civil liberties violation? And so I want to toss this one to the panel, because as a former government national security lawyer, when there's only been a few things that when I open the paper in the morning, I look at and I say, wow, that one's really bad. And this was one of them. because this you have different than records, different than metadata, which is just, the to and the from and has less constitutional protections. This was the content of his communications. So there's a huge implication to that because we're talking about content. And the second piece from a national security side is the fact that some government was conducting surveillance of this conversation between Michael Flynn and the Russian ambassador. Well, that just blew an intelligence source. So from a national security perspective, it's also bad. So who wants to sort of take the first? I'm just curious in terms of your reactions on where you guys saw this in the spectrum of leaks, and from a reporter's perspective, are there certain leaks that give you pause? Sort of I'm curious about the process that reporters are thinking about as they decide to publish a leak like the Michael Flynn case. So who wants to go first? Alex?
I'll start out with a general comment. I don't think anybody should celebrate, as a general matter, the disclosure of the fruits of government surveillance. There are limits on that sort of surveillance for a reason, and when the contents of that surveillance are leaked, that's something that we should take seriously. I don't have an absolute view about how we should think about those disclosures. I think, like most of what Shane's conversations are probably like with his editors when he decides whether to publish a story, it's a balance, and you have to think about the public interest in disclosure as against the expected harm in disclosure. In this sort of context, I think a relevant consideration would be if and when there's a prosecution that results from what was disclosed by these monitored conversations, what aspects of that very surveillance would become public anyway? Because it's not, they may very well become public as part of an indictment or a prosecution or the case against somebody, and I think that's a relevant consideration. But I think as a general matter, we shouldn't, we shouldn't take lightly the disclosure of the fruits of government surveillance.
I feel compelled to say something about it because I share a byline on a story that disclosed some of this information. So I guess I would put an option C on that question, which is both.
Yeah, I was going to say both.
Both. It's both. I can say, one of a number of reporters who was reporting on this issue, it was not lost on any of us the extraordinary nature of the information that we were learning, both A, because it went to the content of, as has been clearly reported, surveillance intercepts. B, it also showed the National Security Advisor to the President of the United States lying about his interactions with an ambassador from a hostile nation. This was extraordinary information, and if the sort of threshold question is there a public interest in that information being known, I feel like it answers itself, yes. And we can see the consequences of what happened. Mike Flynn had to leave his job because he was lying to senior officials in the White House about these contacts, and it's become, both a central element of the Russia investigation, but also an act for which Michael Flynn pled guilty to lying to the FBI about this very conversation. So, it's one of those moments where the trust, I guess, the public trust that is invested in us as reporters to really take extremely seriously what we're dealing with and not treat the information cavalierly is kind of at its maximum. Because I agree with Carrie. I mean, this is one of those ones where people look at this in the paper and go, are you kidding me? Like, somebody is revealing the content of intercepts to a reporter. And Michael Flynn, let's be clear, does have the presumption of privacy and civil liberties protection. When he is intercepted in these documents, this is not a publicly known fact. He has every expectation that this is not going to be printed in the newspaper.
And the intelligence community has procedures by which they're supposed to protect the identity of Americans who are captured on these types of intercepts.
Right.
Kate,
right.
What's your take?
I would agree with Shane. I mean, it's an incredibly grave disclosure, and yet the source decided it was warranted. And I think putting ourselves back in that, it's hard to remember the exact timeline, but it set off a series of lies from the administration, from Sean Spicer at the podium to, we don't know if it's a lie or not, but Vice President Pence going on national TV and sort of vouching for Michael Flynn. So I think putting yourself in the shoes of the source and sort of watching what's taking place around him or her, and realizing, I'm going back to what you're saying, what the government knows versus what the public knows, and thinking about the story that's being put out there is so far from what's actually going on behind the scenes, and the public has a right to understand what's taking place. I think that those were considerations that were weighed, and in terms of what the reporters think about, number one, is someone going to die? I think is like, when you're reporting.
You're talking about the factors to the
determine-
editorial process and deciding whether to publish?
Yeah, I mean, covering the Pentagon for a long time, it was rare, but every once in a while, like, that was something you had to think about. And in every circumstance, if that was the case, the decision would be not to, make the information public. In this case, exposing a surveillance method, I mean, it was that the ambassador was being listened to by the U.S. government. I mean, most people would assume that that's the case, I think.
You would have thought that Mike Flynn would have assumed that too.
So, but reporters and editors take those considerations very, very seriously, in my experience. And it's not unusual to not publish something because of it.
So let's see what folks here thought. Okay, so 80%. Shane? 80% think that it's
20% thinks we
justified
can
in view of the extraordinary circumstances. 20% think that it's a major civil liberties violation. And Shane's point is very well taken, that there probably is a good subset of folks here who think that the answer should have been C, both. It can be one, both of
The
them.
thing I was just going to add, a little bit of a different perspective from being inside these DOJ conversations for the last couple of years, is that when a major leak like this comes along, as a press lawyer, you immediately think if there's a leaks probe, they're going to go straight for the reporter. It's the reporter's sources are going to be exposed. And then you get inside some of these conversations with government people, and the audience here may find this all very self-evident, but I've come to see just how incredibly complicated it is for prosecutors to bring a leaks investigation, all the way through to the point where they would be going for the reporter's testimony, say, at trial, that there are the internal deliberations at the Justice Department. You may have an intelligence agency that initially is all gung-ho, but then when it comes to that moment where they're going to need to cooperate in putting evidence up on the record in a trial, or in other ways cooperating for the ultimate prosecution, the intelligence agency decides that it's got more at risk in going forward than it may have in pursuing the leak. And then you've got the prosecutors who may take a case, all the way through, and then see, as they did with Petraeus, that there was a plea at the end, Cartwright, a pardon, and you can see how many different checks there are in the system, even before you get to whatever role the reporter may play. And so, in some ways, we've come to see, while the reporter may be a key part of the internal deliberations, we're not really exactly in the center of these cases. We're kind of off to the side somewhere. And when our issues become important, of course, then to us, they're the most essential part of the case. But the sense I've had from the government side is that, we're there somewhere in the chart of evidence they've got to put together, but we may not be right in the center in the way we think we are.
Just one small point. Well, first, Shane, I hope you didn't take what I said to be a criticism. I think I probably would have come out the same way if I were in your shoes doing this balance. But I think it raises an interesting question about institutional competence. I think government officials who have to decide every single day whether something should be public or should remain secret, I think focus overwhelmingly on the harm of disclosure. I think that's their job, and the institutional incentives are all aligned in favor of, if you see a harm, keep it secret, right? Because if you accidentally disclose classified information, you could be subject to prosecution, you could lose your job, your license. If you keep something secret that shouldn't have been kept secret, if you disclose something if you keep something secret that the public interest by all rights suggests should be public, you don't get an award for that. The incentives are aligned against disclosure. And so I think government agencies are not great at conducting the balance between harm and public interest. they're very good at understanding the harm that might come from a disclosure if sometimes they overestimate it. And say what you will about established media, and there's a lot of criticism in this country of established media. But when we lose major media establishments, what we lose is that journalistic ethos, the one that requires journalists to think seriously about harm versus public interest. That major media newsrooms go through every single day for every story, for every single detail. That's an important function that media engages in every day. And you may say that as between reporters and government agents, you prefer government agents to do it. But you need somebody doing that balance. My own thought is I like the fact that Shane is thinking very thoughtfully about these questions and digging into them every time he decides whether to publish a story like this one.
Let me ask you a follow-up about that, and then also I want to ask do we have a mic for audience questions? Okay, so I'm going to ask a follow-up question, and then also we've got about a remaining few minutes for some questions for the audience. So let me pose this question, and then think of your question if you have one out there. When the mic does come to you, I'm going to ask you just to use the mic and identify yourself and then ask your question. But before we go to our first audience question, let me just ask you a follow-up on that, Alex, which is that over the last years, particularly after the Snowden disclosures, which began in 2013, can't believe it's that long ago, in 2013, the intelligence community in particular launched a whole transparency effort, which was an institutionalized effort to disclose more, to declassify information, to push information out to the public, to be more transparent. And this initiative was led by civil liberties officers and transparency officers in the different intelligence community elements and was sort of spearheaded by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. A lot of that transparency effort focused on legal opinions, for example, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court opinions, or policies, but not on the substance of what's really going on behind the scenes. So I'm just sort of curious if any of you have a reaction. Have those transparency efforts been meaningful, or is the government still not very good at this?
I think there's obviously room for improvement, but I think those changes were very important. I think we know a lot more now about how, and I used to focus on NSA surveillance in my work at the ACLU. We know a lot more now about how the NSA interprets its legal authority under Section 702, for example. We don't know very much about how it interprets its authority under Executive Order 12333, which actually governs the bulk of its surveillance, and so that's an area where they could get better. The Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board plays an essential role and has played an essential role in disclosing more of this information. So I think, I think the efforts post-Snowden were made in good faith to try to narrow that gap. I think there's obviously room for improvement, though, and I don't think.
But Kate and Shane, you're still not you're not going to the government and asking for information, right? I mean, you're still relying on sources.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I mean, to get NSA credit, like, after the Snowden leaks, there was more information disclosed about their compliance processes, and people who were never allowed to within a mile of a reporter were allowed to give interviews, and so some of that happened. But right, it hasn't been kind of a radical adjustment to where now they're just calling us up and and delivering us information that we ordinarily wouldn't have obtained. No.
Mm-hmm. And there are definitely places where they're clawing it back, like at the Pentagon, whether it's civilian casualties or data about Afghanistan. There have definitely been attempts to keep that not disclosed to reporters, information that used to be disclosed. And the other thing I was going to say,
and you're seeing that in the new administration, or?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
Definitely.
And in the last, or post-Snowden, I was going to say, there were also steps taken to protect whistleblowers from retaliation. I think the idea was to create a better pathway for someone like Snowden to work through the system rather than going to the media. And my sense from the lawyers who work in that space is that there haven't been enough cases that have moved through that yet to really make clear whether that system works. It feels like the jury's still out, and so I think if you're a government employee who wants to blow the whistle, it's not entirely clear that the system in place that's meant to protect you from retaliation actually works yet.
Okay. All right.
I would just say, to be terribly parochial, Alex raised it earlier, the fact that we still know nothing about national security letter policy against the media is unbelievably frustrating. And we've been asking those questions for years post enactment of the guideline revisions. And so in our little area here where we're trying to get more transparency, we have been able to get absolutely zero.
All right, let's take an audience question. Come on. Someone's got a question for this panel. Yes, right here, sir. And hold on, if you could just wait for the mic to come to you. She's going to make her way over. And if you could identify if you have an affiliation, and then feel free to ask your question.
Sure. My name is Russ Hoyle. I'm a longtime former writer and editor, and wrote a book about the march to the Iraq War called Going to War. In the course of writing it, I found myself in a little bit of a pickle. I was very interested in Judith Miller's reporting, and I found myself in the position of being a journalist with long-standing, imbued journalistic ethics, very interested in who leaked some of the information to Judith Miller. So I'm presumably in the position of a good. Now that's a case in which I would argue that the public needed to know, if not necessarily where the leak came from, the substance of the leak. And I thought, is that case familiar enough with you that some of you could comment on it?
Yeah, I mean, it's. I think you're referring to her reporting on suspected weapons of mass destruction programs in Iraq, right?
Yeah.
In the lead up.
I can focus it more.
Well, I mean,
focused on Scooter Lee.
Well, are you talking about Judy Miller's reporting on WMD, or are you talking about the Valerie Plame incident? Are you talking about the Valerie Plame incident or the WMD reporting?
The fact that she, as we recall, went to prison.
Right.
And part of the reason she wouldn't is because she wouldn't be able to see the sources in part of the Valerie Plame thing.
Right.
And that's a piece of the WMD.
Right. I mean, that's a case where, she kind of, I'm not sure what your question is. Do I feel strongly about whether she should have gone to jail, or?
Well, it's just a case in which it's in a journalist's interest to make the kind of discovery that would come from knowing the leaker. Very simple. And I just asked for a comment.
Well, so let me ask you guys, is there, to the extent that you're familiar with that case, can you talk about sort of what ended up, that Judy Miller ended up going to jail? What was the issue that then?
Well, she wouldn't identify her source. I mean, so she went to jail because she was subpoenaed to identify the source, and she was found in contempt of court. So they, threw her in the slammer. And Scooter Libby famously wrote her a letter saying, set yourself free and identify me. I absolve you of the source protection relationship that we had. I think, and maybe what you're getting at in this is, and there was a question, I think, about some of her reporting and whether or not it was tendentious and whether or not she was being fed information to make the case for war, and where was she really getting this, and was this legitimately her multi-sourcing and going and getting the view of the intelligence community about WMD in Iraq, or was Scooter Libby just feeding her talking points to drum up the case and put it on the front of the New York Times? I personally think that was, not a great case for us to go to the barricades over, because it had all of these complications. At the same time, Judy Miller has every right to protect her source and every obligation to do so. These are not always, we've been talking about another case, these are not always clean cases where they sort of, everyone looks heroic. They're complicated. At the same time, she did right by her source, even when he pleaded with her publicly to go ahead and break the contract. She still wouldn't do it.
All right, I'm being told to wrap up. Is there one more question that we can take? Yes, let me take one more audience question over here, and then my organizers are going to pull the cane on me here.
Hi, sorry, I'm Dana. I'm a former government official now in the private sector who dealt a lot with these issues. First of all, I want to commend the panel and the bravery of many journalists to get us a story, even when we don't agree with their publishing some of the information that we have. I think it's important to uphold our values. But could you please talk about, maybe each of the panelists, give us an example where you think a media outlet went too far in disclosing classified information, because I know I can think of a few, but maybe you think there never is one, but I would just kind of like to throw that out there provocatively, whether there are media outlets that are, maybe publishing too much, that expose too much of our national secrets and put too many people at risk, for example, dissidents or operatives.
I think publishing exploit code of CIA hacking tools probably falls into that.
I guess you could say, you could have a debate over whether WikiLeaks is a media organization, and then you could maybe include some of the things they've disclosed.
Which is a whole other panel. I was
Yeah, I was
hoping we were
gonna
going to get
say,
to that question.
isn't
but that
time
is-
running out?
That's a whole discussion I would love to invite this group back for.
Yeah.
Any other follow thoughts on the question?
On the question of particular examples, I just don't, I've not been a part of newsroom deliberations directly on these questions, but I think you can see from our two journalists here that, the balance is very carefully sought after in making sure that the not too much, even in the hands of the newsroom, is published if it really would pose a risk. Right, and you're talking to the government about that. They're vetting that stuff with the government.
But, just one quick additional comment. I not a specific disclosure, but I'm very skeptical maybe I should just say I disagree with the idea that large caches of information should be disclosed without careful vetting and careful application of journalistic ethics, balancing the public interest in disclosure against the harm that might come. I don't believe in that model of disclosure, and I think you could probably fit a few disclosures into that bucket.
I think that's right. That's right. Well, please join me in thanking our panel here today. Thanks all of you for joining us. And enjoy the afternoon at the conference. Thanks.